Eek, the robots are taking over your synthesizers, or so those guys at Synth and Software would have you believe. But behind the sci-fi fun is a very complicated issue: machine learning, neural networks, and art, including music, fine arts, and many other human endeavors, such as creative writing. What's brought all of this to a low boil is a new online program called Midjourney. It generates art, either in quotes or not, depending on your perspective, from keywords that you feed it. All it took was entering words like "the robot army is attacking synthesizers" to generate this month's Synth and Software cover. Eek, indeed. Now, we cover music tech at Synth and Software, and so far the music equivalents of Midjourney aren't quite as advanced yet. But for example, a company called JukeDeck was bought by TikTok. Another one called Soundful has raised a lot of money from major companies like Disney and Microsoft. Soundful's claim to have taught it, quote, "music theory is all you need to know if you understand what music theory really is." But the point is that there's some serious investment in all this, and it's certainly going to get better sooner than later. Midjourney is going to get better too. So should we start worrying, celebrating? What could this mean to artists, including musicians? To sort through these issues, we put together a panel with a range of perspectives. First, Olivio Sarikas is a professional designer coming to us from Austria. He produces very popular, informative, and really outstanding how-to videos and live streams on YouTube. First about Affinity Photo, the image editing program I happen to use for art, and now he's branched out into more varied topics all related to art, such as how to get the most out of Midjourney. Olivio is very excited about Midjourney, and he sees a lot of creative potential for it in his work. He'll offer a full-throated, articulate defense against the objections of people like, well, me, who feel that machine-generated art can only destroy the soul of humanity. Olivio has softened my hard stance a little, which is why we're happy to have him joining us, or at least one reason. Next, Jim Aikin is a deservedly famous music tech journalist. He was a staff writer and editor at the late-lamented Keyboard magazine for more than 25 years. Jim has written a couple of hundred product reviews and tutorial articles on music hardware and software for Keyboard and other magazines. I think it's got to be more than a couple of hundred. But anyway, he's also a novelist, a classical cellist, an amateur computer programmer, and an active blogger. You can find his books on Amazon or at jimaikin.net, but you do have to know how to spell his name right, which is J-I-M, obviously, A-I-K-I-N. Next, Alatrakchi is a frequent contributor to Synth and Software and an accomplished film and television composer with a well over 2 decades-long career. Case is also an award-winning film director who often leverages the latest technology to bring his ambitious ideas to the screen. His most recent directing project is called Everbliss Inn, which is part of an upcoming horror film anthology produced by Blair Witch director Daniel Myrick. And I'm Nick Batzdorf, content director, meaning editor, of Synth and Software. I started out as a film, TV composer, orchestrator, etc., and I'm a music and audio tech journalist, having been the editor of Recording Magazine for 10.5 years, and then the editor and publisher of, also late and lamented, Virtual Instruments, which was a music and audio software magazine, and I've also written all kinds of other things along the way. I've also been a modern artist for the past few years, and I'm just now, quote, turning pro. www.nickbatzdorf.com for those interested. I'm not going to spell my name. So, Olivio, would you mind explaining what Midjourney is, why you're excited about it, and how you see it fitting into an artist's workflow?
Right. Okay. So Midjourney is, at the moment, you can use text to generate images. So you type anything in and it will try to figure out what you mean. It has been trained of about 600 million images from the internet, from all kinds of backgrounds, design, ArtStation images like digital illustration, concept art, photos, all that kind of thing. And you can try to figure out how to write these texts so you get closer and closer to what you want. But of course, our language is very insufficient in describing something. Like when I say, for example, a nice chair, you can imagine millions of different chairs that would be nice. So the AI can also. But since we talked last time on Facebook, it has already evolved. Stable Diffusion is another another AI that creates images, but now it has added yesterday image to image. So you can upload an image, it will look at the image, and then you write a prompt, and it will try to, for example, create a person in the same body position with even the same clothing, with the same lighting, but of course based on your prompts. So this can help you basically puppeteer or give the AI an idea of what you actually are looking for. And of course, if you can draw a little bit stuff like that, you can give it a better idea. And we also have AI where you can draw directly into like an input field, a little like very rough image of a landscape, and then the AI will fill in the rest based on your prompt. So this is becoming more and more specific and more specialized. Now, the interesting thing is, especially like I'm from the background of social media, so I'm right now more of a professional YouTuber, basically. So social media has evolved very strongly over the last years. And I'm not sure if most people realize that, but images have actually become a vital and active part of our language, the written language, not just like something you use on the side. They are actually expressions of what you say, which cannot be replaced by words. When you, for example, use smileys or memes or other kinds of images you post, this is an expression of your emotion, which is very important because text often doesn't carry emotion. You don't know what a person means by that. So these images give emotional context and they give you more interaction to react to that message, right? Also, they make it shorter to interact with people. And of course, the whole process of creating content for social media and the interaction we have with social media needs a faster and faster image creation cycle. This is also visible in the media on how images are created today. So in the classic age of photography, for example, you would use your camera and then you would develop the film and go into the studio to like, what is it called? The development chamber to put it on paper and then send it and then they print it and stuff. It's a very long process. Maybe takes a week or something to get something into a magazine. That is useless today. You need to be able to make a photo and then some seconds later you post it online. But often you can't like have the right image for that. And you also maybe want to automate that. This is where AI, for example, can be used, where you write a prompt and then you can send out that image, or you can interact with this image, for example, a digital background for the photo you want to take. So there's a lot of requirement and need for that in all kinds of fields. And I have already spoken with different artists from different backgrounds, from movie, from design, from architecture, from all kinds of areas, who say this is very much what they need because the requirements are so high, the prototyping is so fast today, you can't spend weeks on just drawing out landscapes and buildings and stuff like that. They need the designs like this. They need it yesterday, right? So they can just send out 50 images and then they can come back with ideas and create another 50 images. And that's in the same afternoon, not in a week, just like that tomorrow, right? So there's a huge potential for that in any kind of creative area, basically, right?
Yeah, I think I'm looking forward to the day when I can sign on to Midjourney and type more cowbell.
You can do that already.
And it'll produce something that looks like a cowbell they give you when at the gates of hell.
This sounds very exciting, but I think we have to look at it from two angles. One is, as you were talking about, the need for rapid commercial usage of media product, let's say, is one thing, but the expressive aspects of AI-generated media are a different thing. And I don't want to leave aside the question of the aesthetics and focus solely on the commercial aspects.
Right.
Either do I, believe me.
Yeah.
One quick point, like you started when you read the text speaking about music, and I immediately thought, didn't music come up with that first? Because we actually call it the synthesizer because it automates and synthesizes things that we have as actual instruments. And of course, at the beginning was the critique, oh, this is going to replace something. And you have very simple sine waves and saw waves and stuff like that. But through the modulation, these sine waves become art afterwards. A MOOC is just a machine and it creates ugly sounds. But when you're an artist and know how to use the machine, you can make amazing sounds and become film scores and anything we hear today. Most of the stuff is created either by synthesizers or by samplers, right? So we already have that process where we use machines and we modulate them long enough to create something that we find amazing. So the artist always finds a way into the machine and go beyond the medium of what that machine can create. And this is the job of the artist: overcome the machine and then create something that is unique and expressive and changes our view of the world and culture.
Sure,
Okay,
but
so-
that's not what you're describing in Midjourney. In Midjourney, you're describing an entirely automated process, not something that the artist interacts with.
No, that's not true. You have to enter a text and the AI tries to figure out what you mean. But depending on what kind of text you enter, you can also enter images as a source for that. You can use very long prompts if you want to be very descriptive. You still have to have an idea for that. So, for example, one thing I ask critics often is, do you speak English? And when they say yes, I say, okay, how many master poems have you ever read in your life? Have you ever written in your life? Because you can speak English and poems are very short. They are like a prompt. So can you write a poem or a haiku that's masterful and artful? Probably not. Just because you know something and can use it doesn't mean you can use it as an artist. So there's the huge difference of writing just any prompt. And of course, right now the results look magical and beautiful and awesome, but just because we don't compare them directly to masterful art that has a purpose and to the purpose behind that art, right? But if we would do that, there is a huge difference between just a beautiful image and an actual artwork, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. There's a huge difference. You know, I'm involved in self-published fiction, and God knows there are thousands and thousands of horrible writers doing self-published fantasy fiction, and they hire, in many cases, prefabricated cover art. And you look at one of these prefabricated front covers, and they're all alike. And
Right.
they're
Yes.
glowing and beautiful, but they're
Yes.
generic. There's no real personality in there, and probably there's nothing real in the novel either. So maybe it matches.
Right. And that's exactly the point. Like when you go on the community feed right now of Midjourney, you see tons of images of always the same stuff. You have your favorite movie stars and Marvel comic characters, and you have cyborgs and zombies and stuff like that, because people try out what they know, like the first thing that comes to mind. But it takes a real creative and genuine people to create something that goes beyond that, where you look at an image and thought, wow, I never thought about stuff like that. This is a huge, unique and new idea, right? So this is the important thing to come up with.
So one of the most challenging things that I find about future technology or upcoming technology is that we have a tendency of trying to fit it into the process that the way we understand it today, right? It's very difficult to start thinking about, for instance, in terms of what is the process going to be like 10 years from now or 5 years from now, because we don't know yet, right? So because of that, we are all thinking about, okay, this is our methodologies, this is how we work. And then we have a tendency of saying, okay, this is going to fit into that pipeline, and maybe it's going to make things worse or better for that specific pipeline. I'll give you an example of this. I was listening to the radio yesterday, and they were talking about, the electric vehicle revolution. And Ford right now is working on a brand new pickup, like fully electric, F-150 electric version. And one of the things that they kind of brought up is just a very simple concept that makes total sense. It's very like, duh, like once you hear it, but I just hadn't even like occurred to me that when you have a pickup truck, you have like a source of electricity no matter where you go. So if you're a contractor, all of a sudden you can plug all of your tools into your pickup truck, right? Before you would have had to drag maybe a little gas power generator if you were like on site and you needed to tap into electricity, and now you don't. And to me, that's one of those kind of like type of concepts that, yeah, it's like you hear, it's like, well, of course, but before somebody actually said it, like I hadn't thought about it in those terms. So for me, when I look at Midjourney, and more specifically, I start thinking about like, what is Midjourney for music looking like, I start thinking about those types of case scenarios. It's like, how can we use this thing not just to generate music automatically, but to actually maybe improve on the music that I'm writing. Olivia brought up like a really, really interesting point about Stable Diffusion, which is the ability of starting with your own image and then having the machine learning extrapolate on that, you know. And I can see very much that happening for musicians. For instance, imagine that I am sitting at my keyboard and I am playing like a violin line for a score that I'm working on, okay? And I'm using like some really good samples, but, you know, it's still me on a keyboard playing, you know, an instrument that normally has much, much more expression and much, much more nuance. So my ability to tap into a machine learning program and upload the file and say, okay, make what I played sound more realistic. Maybe make it add the style of Isaac Perlman, the way he would interpret this piece. I can see that kind of application of the technology being an enhancement to me as a composer and not as a replacement to me as a composer. So I'm trying to think of it more in a positive way. Like, this is not the machines coming to take over my life. This is the machines coming to enhance my ability to make my work even better. So I think that's something to consider.
It is. And I have to say, going back to Olivio's analogy with the synthesizers, when he first said that, we all shook our head like that at the same time. So I was like, who's going to answer this? Okay, these are instruments. Okay, the tools, they're giving you sounds to start with. The violin is an instrument. It's just a tool. Bones back in the cave area when they started music were tools. It's a very different thing to use something as a tool, or I would say as a tool to enhance what you start with, whether you feed it a picture that it enhances or what Kay is just describing. It's very different from what my original reaction was when Olivio and I had actually a really interesting discussion on Facebook. When I said, this is sucking out the soul of humanity, you push a button and it draws, and there's your picture. So it's important to make a separation.
Okay, look, the thing I wanted to say was, this is one of my notes, is that music making has always been a collaborative process. Even in the 18th century, you know, you didn't build your own instrument. A composer did not play all the instruments in the orchestra. Music has always drawn together people with different talents in order to produce the finished thing that we listen to. And that has not been the case with respect to the visual arts or the literary arts until things like Midjourney start coming along and it becomes possible to do this in the visual arts. And I would hazard a guess that it is unlikely to become the case with respect to the literary arts within our lifetime, because writing prose that makes sense, writing a short story that makes sense, is orders of magnitude more complicated than creating an image.
Fundamentally, I am with you, but I am reading some of this literature that is being completely generated by a machine, and it's kind of blowing my mind in many ways. I like to remind people that right now we are at the brick cell phone level of this technology. We're not at the iPhone level. At the same time, the rate of acceleration is simply dramatic. What we forget is that these technologies took decades to be widely adopted versus something like machine learning that is literally changing our methodology, like literally revolutionizing the way we're doing things from not even in a year. Like, you know, we're talking about like 3 or 4 months ago, I had no idea what Midjourney was, and now it's so prevalent.
Well, you may be right, but I would like to have you send me some links of this supposed literary efforts by machine, because frankly, I don't believe it.
Okay, I will. But once again, keep in mind right now we're at the brick cell phone level, and we're gonna get to the iPhone level like very, very quickly.
Look, that has been the prediction that people have been making about machines for many years.
Sure.
You know, if you go back to the 1930s and read Isaac Asimov's robot novels, he was predicting all sorts of things about the future, but his robots used vacuum tubes for brains because the transistor hadn't been invented yet. So he was wildly over-optimistic, is what I'm saying. And I think we need to be careful not to be wildly over-optimistic today when we look 5 years down the road. You know, I'm from Missouri, you got to show me.
I agree.
There was a nice quote, Georges Bizet, who in 1869 said, music is a wonderful art, but it's a terrible way to make a living. Words to that effect. Threats to musicians from having their livelihood taken away is nothing new.
I just got passed on a very high profile project that in the past would have never dreamt of going in this direction. But basically they communicated to me that this year they were opting to use library music for their program. And it just kind of blew my mind. The general trend, especially at the more corporate level, is where can we shave off costs? And this is why I think technology like Midjourney right now is very, very appealing to a lot of people that are looking to see how they can pay even less for the content that they need.
There's a concept, a philosophy about how technology progresses, and it usually is, especially in cultural way, in the artistic way, is that at the beginning when a technology is new, the people who use it are very amazed by it, and it's kind of the honeymoon phase. And the thing you create at that moment is about that technology, and everything is like just the excitement of how cool is it to have that. You can see that with, for example, the computer and with Isaac Asimov, stuff like that. The people back then, when it first came out, have been super amazed, and movies and science fiction, all kinds of things. They thought, okay, we can predict the future. We have machines that will do all the work for us. And then, of course, this is overestimation. It never happens like that. But then we come to a point where technology is not as amazing anymore. So the excitement is gone. The honeymoon time is gone. And then it becomes actually the tool we use every day. And so it slowly sinks into our everyday move. And we see that now, where we have computer had for some time, that now computer are part of everything we do. And you can actually attach them to everything you're doing throughout the day. You wake up, you're using your smartphone, you can talk to the lamp and the heating and everything around you and order stuff from the internet, because now it's part of our everyday life. And this is the actual application of technology. What Kai said about the transition, it actually fits really well. When Heidegger wrote about the machine and artwork and stealing the aura from that, a lot of people think he meant it negative, but actually he meant it positive in the way, was it Heidegger? I'm not sure right now, maybe it wasn't. Anyways, he actually meant it in a positive way, in the sense that the machine enables you to do things that you can't do yourself. And this means you can cut loose from tradition and also from the limits of your own personal mind and your skill set and your background, because the machine can do different things for you can't do. So this is actually opening up art and also the ability of the artist to do everything they imagined to do, right? So there's a huge freedom. It's not a limitation. It doesn't take away from art. It adds to art, because suddenly you can use other backgrounds, other ideas. And we've also seen that, for example, with the camera. We think like, oh, it's just a machine, the photo camera, stuff like that. But it's not true, because the camera has a progress and the process, and there is tradition and technology built into that. For example, of course, the way a camera works is central perspective. This is optics, but it's also how Western culture works. We have this kind of perspective in our paintings at the time, and we're still using it. But there's also, for example, if you think about David Hockney, he tries to use photography in a way where it removes perspective by taking a lot of photos and then arranging it in a way where it becomes a perspective-less picture. Again, so there is the ability to do that after all. This leads over to where Nick said, but this time it's different. This is also a classic argument of that. Now we have AI, and of course AI is like close to the singularity, and it's not just a machine. But it's actually wrong, because AI is an evolving term. We have called things AI in the past, like, for example, in video games, the tracking on where the character runs, or to recognize people in photos, so tracking people in video, stuff like that. It's not longer called AI, because just now it's just a software, it's just a tool. And the Midjourney AI, as we call it right now, is just image generation. It's not smart, it's not intelligent, it's not a singularity or can work on its own. It's just a tool. And a couple of years down the line, we will see it like that, and it's becoming just a plugin in Photoshop, stuff like that, right? So there is a lot of this kind of overestimation of what technology actually can do, rather than seeing that it's just a machine and the processes helps us and will integrate in our lives. And one of the very important things also we can see in history with the industrialization and the machines and photography and stuff like that is when you look at us as we are right now, we have the ability to create wonderful ornaments for the buildings, amazing clothing like in the Victorian style, all the kind of stuff, wallpapers with beautiful prints. But when you look at the reality, we have a t-shirt, a jean, there is no ornaments on the buildings, the walls are white, because now that we can do it, we don't want it anymore. And this is how we treat all kinds of things, where we run for something so frenetically because we dream about having it, and as soon as everybody can has it, it's becoming boring. And at that point you start to think about, well, now we invented the technology, how can we actually use it for something that makes more sense than just being opulent and acting like a rich lord from England, right? And this is what we do right now with the technology we have, like with computers, as we integrate it in the everyday life to make things easier and automate them for us, rather than doing it the classic way, right? Sending a letter instead of an email, stuff like that.
Olivio makes like some really, really excellent points, and I agree with him. And the problem, once again, is not necessarily the machines, is the people, right? One of the things that is overlooked is the devaluation of the commodity. Like, one of the applications of the software right now is text to code. That ability to write code, because it is so complicated, is generally fairly highly valued. However, the moment that someone like me can type, okay, this is what I need a like a window here, I need like a button that does this and blah, 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 and the computer can kind of translate that into the code required for me to have that application, all of a sudden the coding professional becomes devalued. Why should I have to pay so-and-so this much money when I can just do it myself with the machine learning AI algorithm? The same thing is true for what Midjourney is doing. The same thing is going to be true for the generative music that is going to be created by machine learning. There's going to be a devaluation of the craft. And that is something that I think it's important to also talk about, because it is a fact, I think.
That sort of gets into really a political issue, which I think it's important to put in a separate category from the artistic issue. Olivio, there's a book called This Time It's Different, written by David Autor. It's a guy at MIT. What that comes down to is, an economist calls it productivity, which is how many man hours it takes to produce a widget. And the political issue is, if 10 people own the robots and everybody else sits there and starves, then you have a problem. If the profits are shared more widely, then we have an easier life and we can all spend our time doing something that's more worthwhile than having the machine do all the work. Okay.
Yeah, that's why I think Linux is important, and why I really like VCV Rack, because you can do so much for free. Of course, you need a computer, but it's very different as an economic model than something like Photoshop, which is expensive. The thing I wanted to say about machine-generated music, I use Reason, and it has a lot of what they call players, which are rack extensions that generate musical ideas for you. And I've used these a little bit, and they can indeed spark creativity. They can generate ideas that you might not have thought of yourself. That's the positive side. On the negative side, what you have is people who promise that you can learn music theory in 10 minutes, just download this app. And the ideas that are built into the app are perhaps adequate or perhaps not, but the people who need the app don't know and are unable to tell the difference between a good music theory app and a not good app. And in fact, my friend Peter Gorgas has a whole website called UJam, which markets itself as, you don't need to know music, just go up to this website and you can create music. And I like Peter, and he's a very nice guy, but I don't quite agree with his take on musical ability, possibly because I have musical ability and I'm just an old guy going, get off of my lawn.
This was directed to Jim based on something that you had said earlier. It's a quote from Sibelius. He said, "Art is the signature of civilizations."
That's Sibelius, the software or the human?
The human.
Sorry,
the human,
I just had to say that.
Yeah, the software is named after the human, I think. But anyway, so that was one of the points. You had written something about AI before, and you said that one of its limitations is that it can look back at what already exists rather than being a reflection of what what's in people's minds now.
Yeah, okay, this is a complex topic, so I'm going to take a
Yeah.
couple minutes and try to explain. Back in the mid-90s, there was a fellow over in Santa Cruz named David Cope who was attempting to write computer software that would compose music in the style of Mozart or Scott Joplin. And I wrote a letter to Computer Music Journal, which people still cite, I guess, in which I attempted to point out the limitations of Mr. Cope's attempts. And one of the things that I mentioned was that a program such as he had then, or I think such as we have now, perhaps with AI, the limitation is that it can only work on the stuff you feed it. It can't go out into the world and look at your garden and get inspired by the dilapidated appearance of my backyard. It can only do what you feed it. And the thing about Mozart, trying to get it to write in the style of Mozart, is that Mozart did not write in the style of Mozart. Mozart wrote whatever he felt like writing. Okay, if he happened to listen to a Gregorian chant one day and he went, wow, there's something there that I like, he would attempt to adapt it. Mozart, in the last movement of his 40th symphony, there's a 12-tone row. Because Mozart had no limits. He would do whatever he felt like. One of his string quartets is called the Dissonant Quartet, and it's not very dissonant by modern standards, but the introduction of the first movement, he wrote in an attempt to not use anything that he knew about music theory and just write abstract music. And that was not in the style of Mozart, obviously. So Mozart attempting to feed stuff into a computer that's in the style of Mozart is at several removes from Mozart himself. But you also get into the questions today about what is the form in which you're feeding the information into the machine. If you say, well, I want this machine to compose in the style of Mozart, are you sending it scores? Are you sending it MIDI data? If it's scores, are you going to tell the machine what subito pianissimo means? Are you going to tell it the difference between grave and vivace? And it will only know what you tell it. It won't be able natively to listen to music and figure out, that's what vivace means, you see. And if you feed it audio, or if you attempt to, I don't think there's really any music software yet that can interpret an audio stream the way the human brain does and pick out the oboe. That's the oboe line. I can hear it in there. That's much too complicated for software. It's something that the human brain is good at. So I doubt that you'd be able to feed it audio. You're stuck with feeding it scores in one form or another. And the machine does not know what it sounds like.
The machine doesn't know anything. That's the central point.
Right.
Machines don't know anything.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here for a little bit, because once again, I find myself philosophically 100% in agreement with Jim. And at the same time, my brain is kind of like spinning, thinking, isn't that the way humans work to begin with? And with all due respect to the younger generations that are watching this, I am seeing a lot more similarities between Midjourney and your music student, in 2022, than I am between that music student and Mozart. And Mozart, by the way, who is probably an alien, let's put that aside in a sense for a moment, just in the sense that we know that not everybody is like Mozart. I recently have been part of like this mentor program where I'm mentoring upcoming new composers. And I got to tell you, their primary methodology for composition tends to be more imitative. I remember when I was in college and I was just listening to, whatever I could listen to, and then just figuring out and then imitating it. And because of that, I don't find so much dissimilarity between the way the machine algorithm is operating and the way the human brain is operating.
See, let me just, that's the challenge with art in general, is coming up with your own voice. I mean, people learn by imitating, but then hopefully you come up with your own voice.
Right.
Big emphasis on hopefully there, because I know people that, have been doing this for like decades, and maybe I'm one of them, and still haven't quite found their own voice.
Try to understand the point that Jim was making with his argument that the machine only knows what the machine sees, because if you're a human, you also only know what you see. If you never leave the room, if you never travel, you only know what's around you. And if you go back in history, you will not find anyone in our 10,000 years of human history that's, let's say, or it's probably more, that has created techno or hip hop or house before it came around, right? Actually, when we look at our culture, especially the Western culture, we have made kind of similar music for hundreds of years, and then machine came around and suddenly changed in a couple of decades from people playing the violin and all that kind of stuff, and having also, like you said, that kind of musical knowledge, to people who know nothing about music, who only know how to tweak knobs and press buttons. Like, I also make electronic music. I have no idea what a harmony is or how to play a chord or stuff like that. I use buttons to play that stuff because I don't need it. I don't want it, because it inhibits me in the way that I create the sound that I hear inside of myself, right?
If the technology is inhibiting you, you haven't learned to. If the music theory is inhibiting you, you're not producing music. You need to learn the music theory. If you haven't learned the music theory, you don't know what you're doing.
If this is what you really believe, then you say, yeah, okay, if this is what you really believe, what you're saying is the Western idea of music dominates every other culture before that. Everything else is not music, because the Native Americans and the Native South Americans and the Africans and the Australians, they did not have our ideas of music, and they didn't write notes, and they didn't have a piano, and still they created music. So the concepts we have of chords and harmonies and stuff like that has nothing to do with creating music in general. You can create music without it perfectly fine.
Do you honestly think that classical Indian musicians in India before the invasion of the British didn't know what they were doing? They knew an enormous amount of theory. It had nothing to. Do you think the people?
Yeah, but not our theory. The way how our
theory. And you're implying that because I am saying this about Western music theory, that I'm denigrating the rest of the human cultures. And that's not right. That's not what I did. That you're misinterpreting what I'm saying.
So how did they make music before they came up with these theories, the harmonies, the notes, the chords, because we had music before that? They just knew how to use the instruments and made music they liked.
Let's just jump in here just in support of what Jim is saying. What happened in those other cultures is that there was a musical knowledge that was transferred from generation to generation, right? So if you wanted to be a musician, like I'm sure this is true for like Native Americans, as is true for maybe islanders or India, like China and what have you. So it wasn't as structured maybe or book-based as it might have been in Western countries, but there was definitely this tradition of passing the knowledge from the experienced musician.
But it was also not based on our concepts of music, on our theories. And this is also when you look at more modern music with synthesizers and experimental music, they had to invent new ways to write down what they were doing, because the instruments are not standard. It's not a piano, it's not a violin. He's hitting a piece of metal with a rock. So how do you write it down? There is no note it's making. It's not following a chord or a harmony. It's a metal hitting a rock, or maybe he's doing something like this. So how do you write it down? What is this? What kind of note and harmony is this, you know? But this is part of music too. So you can't say there cannot be music outside of that system. And also, it doesn't really make sense to say Midjourney is limited because it only knows what you feed it. You can feed it anything if you want, anything at all. So if it doesn't know it yet, it will know it later. Like, for example, if I ask you what kind of music genres will come up in the next 50 years, you don't know because you've never seen them. But the people in 50 years will know because they have seen it.
An AI only knows what you tell it because it is not mobile and cannot move around at random. I can move around at random. I can walk down a street that I've never walked down before, moved by some obscure impulse, and see something that I have never seen before, and that can influence my visual imagination. An AI cannot do that. An AI it can do random stuff. And if you put legs on it, it can wander around at random. We're not at that stage yet.
There you go.
But I think we're also getting into a question of what makes humans human, right? I mean, we're really starting to rapidly get into like a philosophical conversation about
we're having another Westworld, in other words.
Another Westworld. I mean, is it possible to consider, even briefly, that maybe humans are just like an evolved version of Midjourney? Is that a possibility?
Well, we absolutely are.
Probably.
No, we are, because, like, for example, if you look at how, for example, the process of seeing works, when a baby is born, it cannot see. There's just like blurs and colors and stuff. It doesn't see anything. So it takes months for the eye and for the brain to learn how to use that sensory data. And even when we have that sensory data, the brain is making up most of that information. I'm not sure if you know that, but what you see around you is not sharp. It's not in color. It's not as you think it is. And I can prove it to you right now. For example, take any kind of object on your table. Like I have here, like this disinfectant, right? So the way the human eye works is we have in the middle an area that's around 2% of our vision field, a very small area that is sharp and in color. Then there is a bigger area, about, I think, 8%, that is sharp, but it's black and white. The rest of the vision field is not in color, it's not sharp. This is all filled in by the brain. We cannot see it. So what I want you to do right now is hold this at arm's length. In front of your eye, you can read the text. Now move it a little bit to the side, just a little bit, and see and look directly in front of you. Can you still read the text? You can't, because the text is blurry. Is no way unless you look directly back at that object to read the text. We don't see the rest sharp. This is not how the eye works. It's not how the brain works.
I can look. You're saying a lot of things. And in the first place, I can't read it if it's right in front of me because my right eye sucks. But I have to move it off to the side for the right eye.
That's eye damage.
But that's a detail. That's a detail. Yeah. The point is, babies do have the ability to see certain things. A baby is not a blank slate. There have been tests that show, for example, that a baby will recognize a facial image that has no mouth, but they will not recognize a facial image that has no nose.
But not right after it's born. Not in the first minutes or first hours. Doesn't work like that.
No, first all they can do is they can look up at their mouth. They recognize voices that they've heard while they were while they were in utero.
It's called the womb. Yeah.
Womb,
no,
thank you. In utero is what I was trying to say. Can I just say one thing? Whether or not we're just really complicated machines like in Westworld, we have a need to express ourselves. And I actually wrote down a Picasso quote. The purpose of art is washing the dust of daily life off our souls. Entertainment, expression, that's part of our makeup. And that's one of my philosophical stumbling blocks with Midjourney and other related things.
That they have no feelings.
They don't have the same need to express something, and they're.
But we are at the same point again. Does a piano have feelings? Can a piano play music? No, it needs you to play music, right?
Sure.
And even if you set a baby or a cat, you set the cat on the piano, it doesn't play a Mozart piece. It just makes some sound.
Well, I would add that one of the things that fascinates me the most about machine learning and neural networks is that the people that created them are not 100% sure how they arrive at the decisions that they make. And to me, that is so fascinating because you feed something like Midjourney, like millions and millions of images. But then when you type the text, nobody can tell you why Midjourney created the image that it created. And to me, that is where I am starting to see a bit of a blurring between humans and computers. Now, as once again, brick cell phone level, but it is true. Just like it's difficult for me as a human being to explain to you why I made a certain creative musical decision when I composed a piece of music, I am seeing a little bit of that in something like Midjourney. You know, it had to make choices. However, it arrived at those choices. It's still like a mystery. Nobody, like, it's not a code. Like, the machine is having to make some choices. Could it be completely and utterly like a random decision? Maybe it probably is, but it's still making a choice that nobody can quite explain.
But if someone asks you a question about some musical idea that has come into your head, you can attempt to explain it.
Sure.
Can Midjourney attempt to explain its choice of images? That's my question.
I'll give you a counter question. Does it really matter? Like, I mean,
No.
does
Yes,
my
it does.
I wanted to say the same thing. Why does it need to? Does your camera explain to you why it took that photo? No.
That's
You
a bad
have to bring that.
analogy.
You
That's
have
a-
to bring
you're-
that
you're
purpose.
deliberately
It's not a
pulling us
bad
off into a
analogy.
bad analogy.
No, it's not. You know what the difference is, and this is also a lot of people bring this kind of argument, why and how, and Midjourney is not art, stuff like that, because it's a machine. It's a machine. You know, the only people, the only intelligent life form we know in this universe who makes art and cares about art is us, nobody else. Not your dog, not your cat, not the monkey in the forest cares about art. We care about art and we make art for ourselves. So a piece, an object never has any purpose unless we know what it is. If every human is gone, if we all die, nothing is there anymore. The Mona Lisa doesn't have purpose on its own. It's not an artwork on its own. We have to add that value to it. There is this classic quote where you say, is this art or can I throw this away? Because at some point you don't know, because modern art looks sometimes like crap, and this is on purpose. Is this actually an artwork that's worth millions, or is it just like an old ball of hair that you found in your bathroom?
I would bring up John Cage. I'm a huge fan of John Cage.
Right.
Is 2 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, is that art?
Yes. And does it follow musical rules? Like, do you have to know harmonies to sit on a piano and do nothing?
Well,
For me, it's one of the most important works of music because it looks at music as a reflection and asks, what is it actually? And also what happens outside of the piano? Because the thing is, this work is not about silence. This work is also about the sounds that happen around. Like for the audience that is standing around and making and breathing and sweating and farting and all these kind of things, they are music too. This is opening the concept where you say, hey, the musician is the genius, only he can deliver, only he makes art, to the idea of everybody who is included is making art at that moment, because the artwork is not the, how can I say, orgasm and outcome of the artist, but it is what the artist has seen and learned in his time. And he is the filter and membrane where every of that information goes through, and then the art comes out at the other end. This is why, for example, if we had World War II, afterwards we had very sad and depressing art for some time, especially in Germany, because people were sad and depressed. They didn't make funny, nice art. And then, of course, it changed after time and they went back to party time, right? But
yeah.
the artist filters what is happening in the culture around them. It's not, it's not independent.
John Cage, who in my opinion, if he was still alive, I think he would be giddy about the possibilities of Midjourney. His compositional method was based on chance. He would literally be flipping coins or rolling dice to arrive at musical decisions. His entire MO was to remove like the artist from the art. And
it's not entirely correct. First of all, as a footnote, John Cage himself seemed to have been embarrassed by 4 minutes and 33 seconds. He never really quite wanted to acknowledge it in interviews, but his compositional methodologies in the latter part of his life certainly did involve chance operations, but they were carefully chosen chance operations. He was very involved in choosing the algorithms that he would use. I mean, for example, when he wrote Etudes Australis, I don't know how to pronounce it, using the stars of the Southern Hemisphere as a basis for a score, he exerted careful artistic choice in choosing that particular source for his random music. And so Cage was involved as an individual human being with individual sensitivities in the works that he composed. So it's not quite the case to say that a machine could have written John Cage compositions, because he did have intentions.
But I don't understand why you feel the need to compare a machine to a human if they're completely different. You don't compare a monkey to a human because they're also completely different.
Well,
they have different kind of skills and purposes.
May I answer that question?
Yes.
The reason that we're having this discussion at all is because of the confusion between machine composition and human composition. So it's not irrelevant at all to make comparisons.
The confusion is that people look at Midjourney and they are so fascinated by the outcome because this technology is so far removed from what they can imagine that they look at it and it looks like magic, it looks like art, and suddenly it's on the same level as we are. But Midjourney and all other image AIs are very dumb machines. They just create something on random where you enter some text. They are not intelligent. They never said, or of course they can't say because they don't have a self-awareness. Nobody ever said this. You press a button and it's an artwork that has to be in the Museum of Modern Art. You just create inspirations and ideas. It's a tool that you use, and that's it. But you still have to add that purpose to that, right?
Why use it at all if you're still having to do that at the other end? Why not start with your own creative process and stay with your own creative process?
Why use a piano if you can sing?
Wrong. Bad analogy.
But I was going to say,
every analogy you don't like is bad. You can make music with your body. You can make music without instruments. Why do you need a guitar? Why do you need a piano? Why do you need a synthesizer if you can sing and clap and brush and all kinds of things to create music? There is chorus out there. They just use their a cappella, like just with voice. Why do you need instruments? Because the instrument has culture built into it too. It is a process that makes it similar. This is why you can have an orchestra, because the people didn't build their stuff at home with the own ideas of how an instrument should look, but they bought it in a store on how everybody agrees, okay, this is an instrument. So they didn't start with their own creativity. They started by buying a machine that enables them to make the same expression. Right? Yeah, but...
So, pianos are passive. A piano sits there. You must act at every moment when playing the piano. And I play the piano every day. You must act in order to produce music with it. With Midjourney or whatever the heck it is, your act is pressing a button, and it then does a whole process that is outside of your control and not involved with your imagination. No imagination is required to push a button. A chimpanzee could push a button. You can,
so photography is not art.
Let me finish. You've been talking a lot. You could give a chimpanzee a computer screen with 100 words on it and let it click on words at random, feed those into Midjourney and get an image. And the monkey would have no idea what it had done. But you can't do that with a piano. That's the difference.
So to your idea, a photograph is not art because you only need to press a button. And we have an example where a monkey made a picture and it's world famous picture. So that's not art.
You're just being defensive because you're so in love with Midjourney.
No.
Yes.
Tell me why one machine where you press a button and it literally creates an image and is called after that can be art, and another machine where you also press a button and it creates the image is not art.
Okay, it's a matter of a lot of these analogies are a matter of degree. Okay, on one level, what you're saying is true. You push a button and that's what happens. On another level, photography is a highly evolved art form. You can't tell me that Ansel Adams, to name one, just pushed a button. Or
but when photography came around, people said photography is not art because you only have to press a button and it makes for itself. But real artists actually paint the landscape. They don't take a photo. This was the argument at the beginning.
Understood.
Right?
But it didn't take long for that to become pretty obviously a limited viewpoint.
Yes, and it didn't take long for AI to be used in art either, because it's used right now in Hollywood, it's used in design, it's used by the best artists around the world to help them create art because it's a tool like a camera. It's not smart, it's not intelligent, it's just a tool, and it's already in the art process. I talked yesterday with a guy who is working in Hollywood making the newest movies, and he's using it for prototyping. So it's already inside of art, right? People have already accepted it. There's just some people who say, no, it can't be because this and that, but it can be, and it already is. So that we don't even need to discuss that.
All right. One of the things that you said, Olivio, on one of your videos that caused me to soften my stance is that you said that you could use it to create backdrops for your composite images. To me, that's a creative use of it. Not just pushing a button and there's your picture. And by the way, I think people do think it's something that you can hang in a museum. That was sort of my objection.
But none of this, just to be clear, none of this involves just pushing a button and here comes. I mean,
it's a little more.
Midjourney very much requires like a creative input. It's just that creative input happens not to be with a pencil and paper. It just happens to be typing terminology.
Right.
But
It's
the
a matter of
creativity
degree.
is
It's a
still
matter
there.
it's a matter of degree of how much skill it requires. Now,
Yeah,
Case, one of the
if-
things you said to me in a separate conversation was you thought there might be mid-journey jockeys, people whose job is to make mid-journey produce the results you want.
Correct.
Yes.
Because in so many ways, one of the interesting things about Midjourney is that how well you can draw on paper is not really a factor in the quality of the results that you're going to get back. And rather, like, the bigger factor is a good vocabulary, good knowledge of various different styles of art and different authors, and basically being able to narrow down what
Right.
you're trying to achieve in a set of words. That is the real skill. So I can see the same thing translated to music, where being able to perform on an instrument is not necessarily the entry fee into this club. Is going to be more like, how knowledgeable are you? Like, in some ways, we already have that in the form of music supervisors. No offense to any music supervisor watching, because I don't mean it in a negative way. But a lot of music supervisors don't really know how to play music, but they're extremely knowledgeable of music.
Right. I
And
can also give you another good example for that. When synthesizers came out, and there were a lot of very, like at the beginning, you always have very crass variations and stuff comes out. And of course, the newest and coolest musicians need to integrate them in their music. Otherwise, nobody buys that music. But they didn't have time to learn all of these synthesizers. So they searched for people who can create the presets they need.
Mm-hmm.
So they employed people to make presets for them. And even right now, it's a huge industry to create and sell. And the prompt is not exactly the same as a preset, but you can very well imagine that you have an artist who say, I need exactly that. You're a specialist for just making portraits in that style in Midjourney. Can you write a prompt for me just like that? I need it very soon. We have, for example, also the concept artists that create the art for the person who doesn't know how to do it, the director for the game or the movie, stuff like that. They don't know how to draw, but the artist knows, right? It's the same thing.
And I will take it one step further. It's not just the ability to type prompts. It's also the ability to select the right results. And this, to me, comes back to the fundamental idea that I will argue until I'm blue in the face of having a sense of aesthetic, okay? You can call it good taste, bad taste, what have you. You cannot teach aesthetic, in my opinion. You can go to college your entire life, and it's either something that's innate in you or it isn't.
You can help someone develop it, I think, but go ahead.
It's not quite the same. Then we get into like the imitative sort of thing. But fundamentally, in addition to be able to type this set of prompts, Midjourney and like Stable Diffusion and DALL-E like come back with different options. And now you have to guide. That's where the art really comes in. It's not just like the initial set of prompts, but now it's like, oh, no. This one in particular, work on that one. Continue to develop this one in particular, because the creative human, is making that choice. So once again, I look at Midjourney, this is not like pressing a button and off you go. There is still like a great degree of artistic interaction. It's just that the artistic interaction is different than pencil on paper.
Yes, and to connect to that, for what Jim before said about art and random creation processes, he said, well, he did it with purpose and he did it with selection to create something that's not just random, but for a certain reason. And this was in that time and even before that very big in art and in also for people who write poems and all these kind of creative jobs, to have random things in there, to rip up a book and throw it in the air and then see where the pieces land and write a poem from that, write a text from that, or rip up your artwork and make a collage from different things you find in magazines, stuff like that, to create randomness, to have outside input, to get ideas you never came up with. But at the end, the important selecting factor is you know what you're doing and you use randomness just as a tool. And so the same thing is with the Hollywood artist I talked with yesterday. He enters the prompt, he goes to sleep, the AI creates 100 versions, and then he selects 2 or 3 of them, like a photographer would when you go out there, make 5,000 photos, and then you select 5 for the magazine. Because every fool can take a photo, but it takes an artist to know what to shoot and what to select from these kind of photos. There's a lot of people out there who can take nice photos, but still they don't know how to select them and what is the purpose behind them. You need a certain focus, a certain direction, and also a certain vision. And I think this separates the everyday layman who uses Midjourney for fun to create another image of their favorite star from an actual artist who can go beyond Midjourney and create absolute amazing art. Is this person has a vision and an idea and they're super focused, and they will probably work for months or for years on just one idea, while the everyday person is just putting in every kind of thing: Super Mario, Michael Jackson, Donald Trump, whatever, but they don't have a focus why they do that.
I agree with you. I think that's the ideal use of the technology, and I totally approve of it. As a footnote, though, talking about photographers choosing their best images, I was told once that Jim Marshall, who was a very well-known rock photographer in the 60s, a friend of mine looked at some of Jim Marshall's contact sheets, and he said, afterward, he said, no, Marshall only took the good ones. Marshall was at Monterey in 67, and the only photos he took of Jimi Hendrix were the keepers. He knew exactly when to hit the button. Marshall was maybe an exception to the rule, but there was something going on in Marshall's head that he knew how to wait and when to move.
Of course.
Right. Yeah. Some years ago, I had a pretty big depression because I thought I can't create great things. And then I went to a therapist and he said, look at the other artists. They all started as shit. I figured out over time, you need all the shit you create as fertilizer so you can have one thing or two things that are nice in a couple of months, and the rest is just garbage.
Yeah,
even if you look at big artists like Picasso and such, they created a ton of stuff, but it's not as important as his masterpieces most of the time.
He's an exception. I
Yeah,
think.
Mozart is an exception. Mozart was creating great stuff at the age of 6. But in general, yes, you're absolutely correct.
Definitely.
Jim, if you look at Midjourney or other image AIs, just think about it as a dumb machine who creates rubbish most of the time, and then you as the master come in and say, hey, that piece, I take that one. The rest you can keep, delete it.
Sure.
This is what Midjourney is, right?
Sure. I like that concept, and I have no problem with it. My problem, I think, is more a sociological or cultural problem in that this technology and a lot of technologies are being oversold in order to keep the company in business by trying to convince people who have no clue that they too can create art. You know, as a self-publishing novelist, I occasionally dip into the sewer of self-publishing novels. And you have no idea how many terrible writers there are out there who think because they can upload it to Amazon that they're a novelist now. Oh God, it's appalling. And I, without having looked at the stream of imitation music substance that's being promulgated in the music community, I suspect that much the same thing is true there.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, if you look at our education system, we tell young kids, hey, learn the flute, learn the piano. You might be a musician. You might be good at that, because some are and some not. But you just like, it's a shotgun method. You just try. Everybody tries, and then some people will be good and the rest might not be good. But also what you have to consider is we have a lot of, especially with art and with novels and design and stuff like that, a lot of people who have been really shit at their time, nobody wanted it. And afterwards, people looked at it and thought, hey, that's actually a very good idea because the time has changed and the culture has changed. And now it's cool,
That
right?
can happen. Van Gogh, of course, being the classic case, but it doesn't happen nearly as often as incompetent artists think it's going to.
Absolutely. Yes. I was actually at the weekend, I was at an art exhibition from not the academy, but like student art student stuff like that. And I went through it. First of all, and this is what I hate about modern art most of the time, is you go at it, you look at it, it looks exactly like art. And the oil painting looks like an oil painting because it's made with oil paint, and the acrylic painting like an acrylic painting. And you just want to like cry if you see that crap. Nobody thinks, how can I break out of that system? And then you go home and go through the gallery and you see a completely absurd work from Midjourney where you think, wow, that's actually very interesting. Like I saw a picture of a car, like an old vintage car, and it was stuffed with felt bodies of people, just pink bodies in the style of Louis Bourgeois. And it was amazing. It resonates with you and you see reason in it and it tells you a story. Of course, the AI doesn't know anything about that. That's okay, but I see it in it. I would print that and hang it on my wall. And it was much better than anything the artists have seen, because these artists are so stuck in their ideas and what they have seen as culture, but also under pressure of what the galleries want to see from them, that they don't even try to go outside. I would really hope that artists would say, hey, how can I create something that looks not like art? Maybe something that actually has purpose. Like I was like, maybe build a toaster and then say, okay, that's art. I built this toaster myself. And you cannot say it's not art, because art can do whatever it wants.
When you talk about breaking out of what we expect art to be able to do, my father was a painter, and in the 1970s, he was trying to break out of the frame. Started by using unframed canvases. He then started experimenting with one concept that he never finished. He had a friend build him a dodecahedron that would hang, and he was going to paint each of the 12 surfaces of the dodecahedron so that it would spin around. He wanted to get rid of the frame. Okay,
right.
He did several experiments along those lines. So the idea that we need to go beyond what is expected of art is absolutely essential, and I totally agree with you.
I was thinking about yesterday when we talk about marketing and use of AI, was that a lot of what art is the idea and the concept. It doesn't actually have to be the visual form, which is what concept art is, right? So you can, with AI, create artworks that actually react to the person who is looking at it. So every person is seeing a different picture based on who they are and how they interact with the artwork, because the AI can make the art based on the ideas of the artist. And it doesn't have to be Midjourney, because you can train your own AIs and fill it with your own concepts. So that's really interesting to think about art, not as a final result, but as a process that interacts with the viewer, right?
Yeah, I like that idea, but I would think that if you've got an installation, let's say, that is displaying an image, basing the image partly on digital feedback from the viewer, that you also need to think about what data was the AI just looking at whether the viewer is smiling,
right,
whether the viewer is wearing a hat. You have to think a lot about the input. AI is sort of a garbage in, garbage out process. If you want to get beautiful stuff out, you have to put beautiful stuff in.
But so are humans. Humans are garbage in, garbage out, and I mean it's true. I just feel like that's like a little bit like the third rail here, because the question is, when a consumer is faced with spending money on an art form, are they more likely to value something that was created in a traditional way versus, what if I buy a framed Midjourney image? Is that humanly, mentally, is that causing me to say, oh, that image is not as valuable to me because it wasn't created in a traditional way? I mean, that's the question that fascinates me the most, is like, how is this going to impact the way that people value art in general?
But when you look, for example, at your shirt, it has a very nice pattern. Does it matter if a human or like a machine made that pattern, or if it was bought from a stock page just so someone has a new cool trend for the shop? Or what's the difference?
The shirt is the product, and the pattern is one of the elements of the shirt. I'm looking at like the quality of the cloth, I'm looking at the design and all of those things, and then just kind of basing on, I guess I don't necessarily only evaluate the pattern of the cloth as a value.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, you can tear apart every analogy,
right.
And a lot of it is just a matter of degree. I mean, yes, you can say, you look at a pile of shit and you say that's art. Well, yeah, but so what? It's a matter of the human skill and the communication and all that goes behind it. And we're talking about art forms that are passed on from generation to generation, whether they're Western or whatever culture it is. It's a matter of the sophistication, I think, is what it comes down to.
I would point out the word communication is important there. And I'm thinking about Chick Corea, who really heavily valued communication as essential to his art, to try to communicate with listeners. And there is a tendency, at least in Western art, and I don't really know enough about Eastern cultures or indigenous cultures to be able to speak to that, but there's a tendency in Western art to look at artworks as a communication somehow of the soul, which I don't believe in, of the artist communicating directly with the soul of the appreciator, the listener, the reader, the viewer. And when the machine interposes itself between those, or when we aren't sure whether what we're seeing really came from the soul of the artist, or whether it's something that the artist leaned on a machine in order to create, it potentially devalues the experience of art for the recipient simply because of the doubt that am I really being communicated to by Beethoven, or am I being communicated to by a soulless computer? Well, okay, leaving aside the question of soul, I think the communication from one human being to another has everything to do with art. And when we aren't sure that we're getting it from a real human being, I think there's a tendency on the part of the listener to devalue the experience.
I think we are slipping again into the fallacy that the Midjourney is creating the art rather than just being a tool. The art still comes from the person in front of Midjourney who is deciding, hey, we need a nice flower pattern. Let's try 500 versions, pick one of them and put it on the shirt.
Still the perception of the receiver that I'm talking about, not the process. I'm talking about the perception of the person who listens to the music or views the art, to the extent that it is perceived as having come from a computer, the experience on the part of the recipient can be devalued.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point, because I am convinced that maybe like 5 years, and I'm being, I think maybe even a little conservative about that. I think we're going to start seeing like albums, music being 100% generated by computers. If you're reviewing an album that was completely generated by an algorithm, are you predisposed? Are you biased to kind of wanting to nitpick on it, or maybe kind of find fault in it?
I'm very biased.
And that can work in the other direction too. I've read, I don't know any hip hop artists myself, but I've read that there are some hip hop recording artists who are very well trained who will claim that they're not. Right. Because they want you to think that it came directly from their soul rather than from the music theory that they took at Berkeley.
Sure.
You're talking to two people who went to Berkeley, by the way, Jim and Kaiser. It's obvious to them. First of all, the theory follows the practice. So it's not like a really great composer sits down and starts with theory and says, you know, I'm not going to have parallel fifths or whatever it is. Number two, this is not just arbitrary. It really follows physics. I mean, Pythagoras, you know, you have ratios of tones and overtones and so on. Number three, there are great artists who don't necessarily know what they're doing, but they just hear it. Joni Mitchell is the perfect example. No one could listen to her and say, this is crap by some know-nothing person. I mean, the stuff she comes up with is amazing. It still stands up 50 years later.
I would say when you look at mankind and how we act and interact with things, I think you can see that we are extremely selfish and self-centered on what we like and how we do things. And we will change absolutely anything in our way to make it more comfortable and nice for us. Might that be machines or animals or space or anything will be changed by us so we feel good in it. So you can rest very assured, no matter how the machine can create beautiful art, we will either be overflown by beauty and say, nah, we don't need it anymore, like the wallpapers and the Victorian fashion, or we use it in a way we want, but then we still have that human interface, because above all else, we love to have interaction with ourselves. So we want to see someone who picks it and then gives it to us and says, hey, this is a good work, because we also follow other ideas, but human ideas, right? For example, how do you know something is the best author, the best novel of that genre? Because someone told you. You didn't read thousands of books. You looked in the best ever list.
Those lists are meaningless.
No, but if you have the classics, everybody says like Shakespeare and Homer and the Odyssey and Plato and all that kind of stuff. People decide it for you, then you learn it in university. So there's always this kind of human filter in between that tells you, okay, this is good. We create stuff for ourselves. And no matter how amazing the machines are, we will just use them as tools, filter them out, and change the machines to our purpose, right? There's never a point where we are taken over by the beauty of a computer.
I think it's important to separate important from good.
Yeah, but I think what Olivio's bringing up an interesting point, which is like, you know, the role of the tastemaker. And I think it's like very prevalent in fashion and art in particular. I think of Beeple, I'm a big fan of his work, but at some point it was determined by somebody that Beeple's artwork as an NFT was worth, I don't know, what did he get paid? Like $60 million or something like that, you know? And that number was basically like a bit of an arbitrary number. It was not decided by necessarily curators or artists themselves. It was decided by what I suspect is probably like a group of financial entities that said, okay, let's create value in this. So the same is likely going to happen with Midjourney, and whatever musical version of Midjourney is coming, is that there's going to be tastemakers that are going to determine, okay, this is good. Why? Because we say it's good.
I could go further along those lines to say that there may come a point in human culture when millions of people actually prefer computer-generated art simply because it's not, being filthied up with those old human feelings. We want to just relate to the art ourselves without having to worry about what the composer intended, because there was no composer. So we don't have to interact with the imaginary composer. We just listen to the computer and we're happy. Now
that might be happen too, yes.
1984 vision of the future, but it's not impossible.
It seems very similar to what Kraftwerk was trying to do.
I was about to say the same thing. Techno. That's techno, basically. Like the thing I like about techno is it doesn't have a melody. It doesn't have someone singing, no lyrics, no story, no nothing. There's no song. It is a track. The track is meant to be remixed by other artists. And I am the melody, and I dance by myself, solo, eyes closed. I don't have a partner. I don't make moves like I want to get something into my bed. I just want to dance to the music, and the music is going for 8 hours with very little difference in between. And it's not real instruments, because also there's something I don't like. I don't want to have real drums and real guitars in there. That's nice for songwriter music, but not techno. Techno has to be a machine and just a machine. And I really liked about it. And then you have a human, and he's like turning the buttons and the knobs and whatever on that machine. The boxes are making the sounds.
I just heard yesterday Bjork's latest single, and she is kind of sort of bringing back organic instruments, in this case like a woodwind section, but more into like the techno electronic EM context. So she's like taking acoustic instruments and having them perform as if they were synthesizers, which I find to be like really, really fascinating.
One thing about Kraftwerk that you have to remember, though, is that, number one, their whole stance was ironic. They designed it so that you couldn't tell whether they were serious or not. They also did have melodies and lyrics. So there was a lot more to their proto-techno than we would have found on a dance floor 15 or 20 years later.
When the human creator is taken out of the picture, that is surely going to produce a backlash of the opposite, where somebody playing on their head and something, and that'll be their art form. I don't know. Hopefully not. But right. The point is that it always goes in cycles.
Yes. Yes. For me, this is the bigger question than is Midjourney art or not, is the hyper opulence we are seeing right now, because everybody can now be a master ArtStation concept artist. What will come next when people are so overfilled with that stuff, they say, I don't want to see it anymore?
I am looking forward to machine learning generated music, because maybe, just maybe, it might actually create something more interesting to me than what I'm seeing right now. I am utterly bored out of my mind when it comes to modern pop music. I'm apparently not the only one. As it turns out, most people listening on streaming services are favoring like songs from like 30 or even 40 years ago. So to me, it's like, okay, well, maybe this is the counter movement. Maybe it's like, okay, like we as humans are being boring right now. Let's see if a machine can do better. Let's see if an evolution of how we arrive at music might be more interesting to us, more mentally stimulating.
And when you look back at art, we have most of the time art has evolved when a new technology came around, that in between not much happened. And the culture also is built into the machines we are using. When we go back to the piano, you can only play the tones that piano has. And then you have a synthesizer, which makes sounds you've never heard before. But the problem of the synthesizer, when you think about the drum machine, is it has a rotating pattern, 16 steps, usually 32, 64, stuff like that. So suddenly you have music that is going in circles with 16 patterns, right? This is why when I, for example, make music, I turn it off. I don't have any patterns, anything. I just put in the notes when I feel like they should come because I don't follow any kind of rule. What can I do?
I mean, loops are the foundation of, I would venture to say, 99% of modern music.
Sure.
Yeah, and
Right.
that's a problem. But it's also not a problem because it's a solution. Because when you buy a loop library, you're collaborating with another composer whom you may have never met and whose name you may not even know. So it's another example of how technology allows musicians to collaborate over long distances of space and time in order
Right.
to create something that neither of them could have done by themselves. So on that level, yeah, I have no problem with loops, but I just don't like the reason I don't use Ableton Live is because it tends to want to start at the bar line. And I'm a classical person. I want to have a pickup leading into the bar line. And when you need to do that, Ableton Live, it'll do it, but it's just not the right tool for the job.
We need an off-ramp for this conversation. And the one I see is that this is certainly going to make us reconsider a lot of assumptions about what art is and what it takes to produce art, which isn't the first time that it's happened, but it's happening in a different way this time.
Absolutely. I see this very much like what happened in the late 70s, early 80s with synthesizer music. I mean, people were literally being asked to reconfigure their brains and accept that sounds were now being generated through synthetic ways. And we are in another historic point. I'm very excited about this because I know it's going to come with the positives and it's going to come with negatives, but either way, bring it on.
Well, I appreciate, especially Olivio, but all you guys rewiring my brain to see some of the positives. Because I started,
Right.
I mean, as Olivia knows, I started the whole thing saying, I hate this with a passion.
I'm slowly getting you to the dark side of art.
Slowly, but
Yeah.
It's a collaboration. It's just that
Yes.
it's no longer a human-to-human collaboration. It's a human and machine collaboration, but it's a collaboration nonetheless.
Yeah.
Well,
Right,
but
right.
the machine isn't really there. The machine is only there because other humans are there. Ultimately, it's a human-to-human collaboration. The takeaway for me is that I hope that in the process of undergoing this sea change in how we do creativity, I hope that we don't lose track of the fundamental importance of our own mental and emotional processes, both as listeners and as creators. Because when you lose touch with that stuff, you might just as well go out in the backyard and play croquet.
100% agree.
Okay. All right. I think we've done it. Listen, you guys, I really appreciate it. It's a great conversation.
You guys had
Good.
fun. Thank you so much once again. And until next time.
Great.
Okay.
Arrivederci.